Alright, here we go again, folks. I'm still Seth Monahan, professor of music theory, and this is video number 9 in my series on classical harmony and counterpoint. Now, it might be strange to say this, but there's nothing new in this video at all. Instead, I want to take some time to review and hopefully clarify the various uses of numbers we've encountered so far, since this can be really confusing for new students. Now, I'm sure you've noticed that music theory relies heavily on numbers, and also that small numbers, particularly the numbers from 1 to 7, can be used in multiple ways. We're going to talk about 5 such uses here: Roman numerals, scale degrees, chord degrees, intervals, and figured bass. Now, each of these is a way we've used numbers in our music theory studies so far, and what they all have in common is that they serve to describe some kind of relationship. But we need to be very, very clear on exactly what relationships those are. So let's lay them all out first and then look at each of them in a bit more detail. Roman numerals relate chords to major or minor keys. Similarly, scale degrees relate notes to keys. Now, chord degrees define the relationship of notes to chords, independently of any key that they happen to be in. And similarly, intervals relate notes to other notes, again, completely independent of key. And finally, figured bass relates notes specifically to the note that happens to be in the bass voice. Now, to look really carefully at all these relationships, we're going to start with a short choral phrase by Johann Sebastian Bach from his St. Matthew Passion, written in 1727. And the text, Ich bin's, ich sollte büßen, means, it is I who should atone or suffer. And here's how it sounds. Now that's a particularly gorgeous chunk of music, and it was sung marvelously, but to keep things manageable, we're actually going to only focus on one chord, the 5-6-5 chord right before the end. And I'm showing the D flat in parenthesis here because it's actually held over from the previous chord. So this is a 4-note chord. Now let's isolate this harmony and consider it first in terms of its Roman numeral. What does that Roman numeral actually mean? Earlier I said that Roman numerals relate chords to keys. Well, this Roman numeral, 5, relates this chord to the key, A flat major, by way of its root. Or to be much more specific, the Roman numeral says, this is a chord that can be arranged as a stack of thirds whose bottom note is scale degree 5 in A flat major. In other words, E flat. But obviously, this 5-7 chord is made of 4 notes, and they all have some specific identity within the key of A flat major. That's where scale degrees come in. As I said earlier, scale degrees tell us how individual notes relate back to the key they're in. So while it's convenient to refer to this chord with one label, just call it 5-7, we should also be aware of what notes of the scale it uses. Stacking up in thirds from the root E flat, which is scale degree 5 in green, we have G, which is scale degree 7 in red, B flat, which is scale degree 2 in blue, and D flat, which is scale degree 4 in yellow. And I'm going to use color throughout this presentation to make these things as clear as possible. And if we look at Bach's chord, all of those scale degrees are of course present, although they're arranged differently. The chord is of course inverted and in open position. Now, scale degree 7, the red G is in the bass, scale degree 5, the green E flat is in the tenor voice, scale degree 2 in blue is in the alto voice, and scale degree 4 in yellow is in the soprano voice. So here's our A flat major scale. And we've taken these notes, scale degree 2, 4, 5, and 7, and we've arranged them like this. And of course, Bach will resolve that to that. Now, it might be obvious at this point, but Roman numerals and scale degrees, which we just discussed, are alike in that they are key dependent. That means that if we encountered this same exact chord in exactly the same voicing in a different key, the Roman numerals and the scale degrees would both change. Let's try this out. Here, we'll change the key marker to say that we're in F minor rather than A flat major. Now this means that the Roman numeral now changes as well. Now the Roman numeral is 7-6-5 rather than 5-6-5. And to give you a sense of how this sounds, here we were in A flat major. The chord resolved like that. In F minor, it might do something like this. So different key, different Roman numeral, and different scale degrees. Now from the bottom up, they'd be scale degrees 2, 7, 4, and 6 in F minor, rather than 7, 5, 2, and 4 in A flat like we had before. But let's reset things back to A flat major so we can take a moment to recall that there is in fact another way to refer to the notes of this 5-7 chord, and that's with chord degrees, which relate notes to chords independently of the surrounding key. Now, as it happens, we've already used one of these degrees in our discussion already, when we referred to E flat as the chord's root. And you know from video 8 that each of a 7th chord's tones has a special name. There is the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th. And that each of these names stick to these notes wherever they appear. So Bach's harmony has the chordal 3rd G in the bass, the chordal root E flat in the tenor, the chordal 5th B flat in the alto, and the chordal 7th D flat way up on top. So again, here's our chord as presented in the upper right. Root, 3rd, 5th, 7th. And Bach has arranged it 3rd, root, 5th, 7th. You might also recall that chord degrees give us one way to think about chord inversions. For instance, when you see 5-6-5, you may think, aha, yeah, that's an arrangement of 5-7 with the chordal 3rd in the bass, and you'd be exactly right. Now, it's worth stressing here that unlike scale degrees and Roman numerals, these chord degrees don't change when we change the key. They refer back to the chord, not to the key. So if we went back to F minor again, notice that E flat is still the chord root. G is still the 3rd, and so on, even though the Roman numeral and scale degrees have changed. So moving on, yet another way of referring to the notes of this chord are through the figured bass. And as you remember, figured bass relates notes to the note that happens to be in the bass voice via intervals. Now, I know that students often fall into the habit of converting figured bass symbols directly into chord inversions. You see 6-5 and you think, okay, first inversion chord, got it. And you're right, but it's important to remember that 6-5 is actually an abbreviation of 6-5-3, and that each of those integers corresponds to one particular note in this chord. For this, it might be helpful to think about a closed position 6-5 chord. Here, look on the left, where these intervals are right there to see on the page rather than displaced by octaves. So let's compare this chord to the one Bach wrote. Both have a red G natural in the bass. And the green E flat, which corresponds to the 6th in the bass figures, appears as an actual 6th above the bass in Bach's chord. There's the bass, E flat is the 6th above it. But the yellow D flat, which is indicated by the integer 5, is actually placed a 5th plus an octave above the bass. So here's the bass, there's the 6th above it, and there's the quote-unquote 5th above it, even though it's a 5th plus an octave. And finally, we see the same thing with the note that's a 3rd above the bass. Bach has placed this B flat not a 3rd per se, but a 3rd plus an octave above the bass. So if we take Bach's bass, G, and go down 6-5-3, 6-5-3, that's how it sounds on the left, and then in the center of the screen you see, here's the bass, 6-5-3 above the bass. So that's how the chord on the left becomes the chord on the right. Now the last kind of relationship there is to talk about is intervals, which serve to relate notes to other notes. And by this, I mean we can relate any notes that happen to be near any other notes, like the alto voice and the tenor voice, or one note in the soprano to another note in the same voice. This won't always come up in analysis, but it might sometimes. Indeed, in the chorale we're looking at, a keen observer would pay special attention to the intervals between the soprano and the alto voices. More specifically, he or she would notice that they are always a 3rd apart, with exactly one exception. And that exception is important. It's the downbeat of the 2nd bar, where they move out of phase for a second and give us an accented minor 2nd interval in what's surely the most expressive chord in the passage. Here are the upper 2 voices alone. You can hardly miss that minor 2nd. And now here's those same voices accompanied by the other 2. That 3rd chord from the end is just so striking. and it would be an occasion to talk about intervals between the voices that were not related to the bass, just those two upper voices. So those are the 5 relationships we've learned so far, and it's a lot to keep track of, I know. But by going over them like this, my aim is to persuade you of the importance of being as specific as possible when you're referring to relationships in a musical passage, because the threat of confusion is pretty much constant. So I want you to imagine, you've just gotten some homework back from your teacher, and there's a big red X and an explanation of what you did wrong. And he or she writes, on beat 4, you're missing the 5th. Missing the 5th. That is the opposite of helpful, and you'd have every right to be frustrated by the vagueness of this language. Does your teacher mean scale degree 5? Does he or she mean the chordal 5th? Or perhaps he or she is referring to the 5th above the bass as articulated by the bass figures. And for the same reason, I think I speak for all music theory teachers of the world when I ask you to aspire to the same kind of precision in your own language. And it's not just for the purpose of clear communication. Vague language is often a sign of vague thinking, and many of the most common student errors arise because of exactly the sort of fuzzy thought that follows from this big pileup of numbers. Just one very common example. When we start learning about voice leading, which is the art of connecting chords in the classical style, we're going to learn that certain notes must move in certain ways, particularly in dominant 7th chords like the one we see here. When this chord moves to tonic, which it almost always does, the chordal 3rd will need to move up, and the chordal 7th will need to move down. But notice that the chordal 3rd happens to also be scale degree 7. And imagine the potential for confusion here. In the same chord, you've got a chordal 7th that must go down, but a scale degree that must go up. You're going to need to be really clear on which one is which. The students make this mistake all the time. They say, oh, I thought the 7th goes up, and you have to remind them, well, there's 2 7ths here, you have to be specific. Are you saying scale degree 7 or the chordal 7th? Precision of language leads to clear thought. Now, obviously, my hope is that this tour through the numbers of music theory will be helpful and not harmful. I know that it's easy to be overwhelmed, but I can promise you that if you're really secure and really confident in these distinctions and the language we use to describe them, it's going to give you a real leg up as things get more complicated, which, alas, in music theory, they always do. But it's worth the effort, I promise you. So I'll look forward to seeing you soon for video number 10.